It's important to recognize that historically, our laws have not protected all classes of citizens in our country. As we've already talked about, there's been many federal laws that upheld institutions such as slavery or disenfranchised people of their property or their land. When the Constitution was written, slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person, and that was for the purpose of representation in Congress. Blacks were not officially given the right to vote until after the Civil War, and even then, the practices of institutional discrimination, those things known as Jim Crow laws, those prevented most blacks from voting in the South. So it's the reality construct of any given time that's ultimately going to determine what the laws will be and how they'll be applied. And we know that different groups of people are represented disproportionately in the U.S. prison system. At any given time, 1 in 3 black men are somewhere in the judicial system, either waiting for trial, or in prison, or on probation or parole. We also know that the death penalty is not uniformly applied to whites and non-whites. Disparity in application of the death penalty sentence is based more on the race of the victim than the offender. When it's a black offender responsible for the death of a white victim, the death penalty is more likely to be imposed. Black defendants who kill white victims are 2.5 times more likely to be sentenced to death than a white who kills a white. There's a racial divide as well regarding who decides to charge a defendant with the death penalty. Those prosecutors who make the decision to charge defendants under the death penalty are overwhelmingly predominantly white. We're a nation of immigrants, but the laws have historically not provided for much protection. Immigrants are seen often as just a cheap source of labor, simply human capital from an economic standpoint. Oftentimes, during the history of this country, different racial and ethnic groups were denied citizenship. The Civil Rights Act forbids discrimination on the basis not only of race and ethnicity, but also national origin. This law offers formal protection. But the reality of day-to-day life is that immigrants don't get near the amount of social protection that they could. Citizenship is a critical issue for many racial and ethnic transplants to our country, but historically the laws surrounding citizenship have benefited whites far more than it has non-whites. It's clear from the statistics of who is in prison that the people housed are disproportionately lower socioeconomic status. 20% of black men have served time in prison by the time they're 30 years of age, as compared to 3% of whites. Those blacks that do not have a high school diploma are at risk to be incarcerated. The rate of incarceration jumps to 60% for those that don't have high school diplomas. There is a strong concern about racial inequality in the justice system. From the issue of racial profiling, which impacts the first contact between police and the public, to the issue of how the justice system works, which is analogized to a funnel effect of taking those with higher socioeconomic status and that are white out of the system. The reality is that there's a higher likelihood that non-whites and lower socioeconomic individuals will be incarcerated. We know from a structural perspective that negative education outcomes are related to urban deindustrialization, neighborhood segregation, and inequality of resources. The war on drugs increases prosecutions for drug-related offenses and creates harsher penalties, which then mean longer sentences. Sentencing ranges have increased in the past 40 years, and mandatory minimum persistent felony offender penalty enhancements and violent offender parole eligibility have increased prison sentences, which have also increased the number of people in prison. If a sentence is increased from 5 years to 20, then for the same offense committed, you have 4 times as many people that will be in prison at any given time. The term prison industrial complex, derived from the concept of the military industrial complex, describes that rapid expansion of the U.S. inmate population to the political influence of private prison companies, as well as the business that supply goods and services to government prison agencies for profit. The most common agents of the prison industrial complex are corporations that contract cheap prison labor, construction companies, surveillance technology vendors, companies that operate prison food services, medical facilities, the prison guard unions, the private probation companies, the lawyers, and the lobby groups that represent all of them. The portrayal of prison building and expansion as a means of creating employment opportunities and the utilization of inmate labor are particularly harmful elements of the prison industrial complex. They boast clear economic benefits at the expense of the incarcerated population. One has to question the idea of incarcerating people when there is profit, which is an end outcome. While a black male is perceived as a threat, a young black male is perceived as an even higher threat. Black and Latino youth are more likely to be stopped on the street, questioned by the police, and be subjected to excessive force. In the juvenile justice system, black females are highly likely to have some kind of punishment or intervention from the justice system for relatively minor things, yet black girls are less likely to get help from the police when they request it. The short video, Silent Beats, helps to expose the everyday stereotypes that black males experience when they interact with people that see them as a threat. We know that racial profiling exists, which appears to be compounded with the police when the person is a young black male. A hate crime is when someone is victimized purely because of their perceived religion, race, sexual orientation, or gender. The U.S. Department of Justice tracks hate crimes, and about half the time they are based on race. The majority of hate crimes are against blacks. Hate crimes are tracked not only by the Department of Justice, but also by the FBI. Additionally, the Southern Poverty Law Center tracks activity of hate groups geographically. Just a quick recap to the historical perspective of the law and race. I want to review this timeline of racial laws in the U.S. Changes in the law are a work in progress. Looking at this history, it's almost 400 years in the making. In order to understand where we are today, one must understand the history and the values and the ideologies of our past and how they're changing.